Good evening, Larry, and welcome to the Bookstore.
Thank you for having me, Jo.
Larry's a journalist and author of Razor, a prize-winning history of Sydney's violent and criminal past. Larry, you grew up in King's Cross and you quickly developed a fascination for these colourful and criminal characters who lived in and around East Sydney. Just how criminal was it?
Well, when I was there in the late 50s, it wasn't that criminal. It certainly wasn't as criminal as it was in the Razor Gang era of the 1920s and 30s, but King's Cross was still a racy place. And the good thing about living there was that when I came to know more about these people later on, I could go back there and actually walk down the streets and look at the buildings.
Massive growth in criminality came out of American-style prohibition measures being adopted in Sydney. What brought these draconian measures about?
Absolutely. Well, it was open go in the early years of the 20th century. There was open gambling, open prostitution on the streets. Criminals carried guns and rifles. Cocaine was able to be bought at a chemist shop just over the counter there, like a Beck's or Vincent's APC was in later years. You could drink all day and all night. And then all of a sudden, around about 1916 and into the 1920s, a series of laws were enacted whereby they attempted to clamp down on these things. And just like Prohibition in America, it was a miserable failure because all it did was send these pastimes, which were beloved of your typical Sydney-sider, underground and put them into the hands of the criminals. And so they enacted a law whereby pubs closed at 6 o'clock, at which Kate Leigh, who was in jail at the time for perjury, rubbed her hands in glee and said, as soon as I get out of jail, I'm going to open up slow grog shops, which will be open after 6 o'clock, where people can come and have a drink, and they won't have to worry about obeying the law, and I can get rich in the process.
Right.
Which she did.
Which she did, and
yeah.
how. So tell me about sly grogging.
Well, sly grogging was in Kate Leigh's practice, and at the height of her time, she had about 20 sly grog shops, and they ranged from either very cheap, nasty rot-gut shops at the back of a terrace house somewhere to quite upper-class establishment that were frequented by politicians, business leaders, minor celebrities of the day, actors, actresses, and they were quite racy places to go. I'm not aware of any other time or era where two women have been the two preeminent gang lords of a city. As
gang ladies.
Yeah, exactly. As Kate and Tilly were, and I think that's simply because they were tougher, they were more ruthless, they were smarter than the men that they were competing for this territory with.
But there is a glamour attached to the idea of two female evil gangsters who weren't moles attached to men. They had empires, really.
They did have empires. At the height of their success, each was worth £200,000, which in those days was the equivalent of many millions today. And the interesting thing was too, their relationship with each other is quite complex. I think that they were always going to be enemies, given that they were two women competing, even though their areas were very different, in that Tilly's was brothels and Kate's was sly grog and cocaine, and there was no real crossover there. There was just something about them that was oil and water. They didn't like each other for many years, and they engaged in some incredible battles, and their henchmen. They arrived early one morning and sort of faced each other off across the road, drinking, taking cocaine and so forth. By nightfall, they were ready to go at each other, and then something sparked, that a bottle was thrown, and they set at each other, and I think there was about 40 people who rioted in the street for 25 minutes. Many were slashed, many were beaten. The hospitals did a roaring trade that night, and no one informed to the police as to who had hurt them.
That was a fascinating thing I found in your book.
Yeah.
That even when they were at death's door, and they could have got away with revealing the name of the slasher or the killer, nobody dobbed anybody else in.
It's like that murder thing that the mafia has, that you just don't, because they hurt your family. It's just not good policy to get involved in that sort of thing.
Yeah, so it must have made it very difficult for the police. Did the police ever get the upper hand?
There were some very, very tough cops who were against them, but they were outnumbered.
I suppose nobody could call up for backup like they do now.
No, it's very different. There weren't that many police, and there were a lot of gangsters, a lot of poor people out there making do however they could in various degrees of criminality. It wasn't until 1930 when they brought in the vagrancy laws there, and there was a section of that, there was a consorting clause which forbade people with a criminal record of meeting in the street. So two criminals might be on a corner talking about Saturday's football match, and that would be sufficient for them to be hauled in. It just became not a good idea to be a gang member anymore.
But for a very long time, in fact, the period that you look at in your book, the razor was the weapon of choice.
It was, yeah.
And those eastern Sydney suburbs became known as Razorhurst.
They did. It was brought about because in 1927 the government outlawed guns and rifles. So all of a sudden everybody lost their guns and started instead carrying just razors, the sort of razor that somebody would shave with every morning. And that became the symbol of being a criminal in those days. And between 1927 and 1930, there were over 500 recorded razor slashings. And this would have been the tip of the iceberg because most people wouldn't go to the police.
Did she carry a razor
Yeah,
herself?
she carried a razor in the folds of her fur coat, and so did Tilly. But,
how terrifying.
Yeah. Kate killed somebody. She killed a man called Snowy Prendergast, who was attempting to break into her house. And Kate said, if you take another step, I'm going to shoot you. He took another step and she shot him. Tilly didn't kill anyone, to anyone's knowledge, although she did slash her husband, Big Jim, and she did exact physical retribution on her prostitutes, her sex workers who dared to defy her, didn't pay her the money that was her due, or went to work for another madam.
Right. Well, Kate and Tilly had some really dangerous rivals as well, didn't they?
Yeah.
Tell us about Norman Boone and Phil Jeffs.
Sure. Well, Norman Boone was a Melbourne gangster, and he was involved in the Squizzy Taylor era, and in fact was a colleague and sometime enemy of Squizzy Taylor, who was the famous Melbourne gangster of the 1920s. And he had heard that there was a lot of money to be made in Sydney at that time, and so he thought, oh, two women running things, and he came to Sydney and he actually started the first razor gang in late 1926, and they set about working as extortionists and standover men. They would go to Tilly and Kate and say, look, unless you pay me X amount of pounds, I'm going to destroy your shop and I'm going to kill you and wipe out your business. They weren't intimidated at all. The warfare raged for a few months, and then one night Boone was walking down in a street in East Sydney. Someone called his name, he turned around and he died in a hail of bullets, and no one was arrested for the crime, for his murder. Everyone suspects that Tilly Devine's gang was responsible for it. So his gang went back to Melbourne, which left Tilly and Kate free for another few years to continue with their various criminal enterprises.
The fierce rivalry between Kate and Tilly eventually calmed down, didn't it? Did they ever become friends?
They didn't become friends as such, but they came to tolerate each other. When World War II started, a new breed of tougher, younger gangster, the Abe Saffrons, the people who were younger and more energetic than Tilly and Kate, and they were kind of relieved, I think, when William Mackay called them both in and said, look, I know what you're both up to. We've always known what you're up to. So long as you can get about what you're doing without violence, without the gang warfare anymore, we'll more or less turn a blind eye to what you're doing. Until in the 1950s, the taxman suddenly decided that neither one had paid tax since the 1920s and just came down on each one very, very hard and hit them for back taxes. Almost overnight, their fortunes, their houses, their furs, their diamonds were taken away from them. And they both died fairly well destitute. Certainly Kate had less money than Tilly did, but they died fairly broke.
Larry's book will be available from bookshops in May. Larry Reiter, thank you so much for visiting the bookstore.
It's been a pleasure, Jo. Thank you for having me.